In this Tinker Tuesday, I'm going to make this BB30 SRAM crank work in some sort of threaded bottom bracket scenario. Now, to look at a bottom bracket, it is fairly intuitive what exactly it does do, though the name itself, admittedly, is far from that. Bottom bracket. In my mind, the name bottom bracket reminds me of the bracket that holds the bottom of a shelf up, not a set of bearings that a crank spindle goes through. But, you know, whatever. Since a lot of the Tinker Tuesdays that have been coming out in the last few weeks have involved some sort of cranks and messing with bottom brackets and trying to make something work, I think it's worth going over a very quick and fairly anecdotal history of bottom brackets. Now, traditionally speaking, most bikes came with this one on the farthest right. This is what is known as a square taper cartridge style bottom bracket, and it is more than likely what is found in your more entry-level to budget option bikes. This style bottom bracket uses a cartridge bearing system with a spacer in between that's all built into one place, with the built-in spindle having a square, tapered fit for the crank that is machined to match for it to tighten on and stay in place. A very simple unit that has stood the test of time and, in my opinion, will continue to. As a matter of fact, people do not give square taper bottom brackets nearly enough credit. There is a reason why they are still used in Karen racing today. But here's what happened. Someone, somewhere along the way, said this is pretty good. But if we make the spindle a little bit bigger, it must be better because it'll be stiffer. And in comes the monstrosity that is power spline style bottom brackets. Notice the little bit of size difference. Slightly larger spindle on this thing. Now I'm going to be a little bit of a pessimist here and say that don't think that the spindle on any cranks was ever really the weak spot for stiffness, so upping its diameter, while I'm sure it did make it stiffer, I don't really see the full benefit of it. And over time of using a bottom bracket with the larger spindle diameter with the same outer diameter bearing, started to rear its accelerated wear out head. As a matter of fact, even this one is pretty messed up. And if you're having a hard time understanding why these larger spindled bearings were wearing out faster than the smaller square taper spindled bearings, take a normal size marble and a steel ball bearing at about 1/8 of an inch, put them on the ground and lean on them. Tell me which one you liked leaning on more. You just learned the basics of point loading. So with the measurable advantage of the stiffness with the larger diameter, but the unfortunate acceleration of wear and intervals between cartridge bearing replacements, it was up to manufacturers to come up with some sort of solution to keep that measurable advantage of stiffness, but increase the wearing of the bearings in the life of a bottom bracket. Enter Hollowtech. This bottom bracket that we know and love today. Basically what they did was pull the bottom bracket outside of the assembly, create two threaded cups with pressed in bearings that just kind of go into place. This kind of crank. Doing this. This bottom bracket and crank setup kind of just became the norm for the longest time. What year that was, I don't know, but it is a 24mm spindle between two bottom bracket cups that are threaded that easily, with one tool, go into your bike's frame. That is until someone at Cannondale got the bright idea to go to an even bigger spindle size and thought for some reason that they would look into the world of BMX and say, hey, to do this bigger spindle size, why don't we just do pressed in bearing cups for 30mm spindles? Those will probably never be noisy and people love to hit things with hammers on their bikes. And again, I'm sure there's some sort of measurable advantage to the added stiffness of these crank spindles at 30mm, but the added creaking and the user unfriendliness that did accompany trying to change a bottom bracket at home, well, it kind of ended up being the bane of the BB30 existence. Not to mention someone at one point had the idea of encasing BB30 bearings in plastic, thinking that that would help the problem. I don't know. I think someone at Cannondale forgot to take into account that noise, creaks, crappiness, and general lack of maintenance is like a big part of the culture of BMX. Anyway, a similar sort of thought process happened when it comes to BB30 bearings and threaded cups, which is where we're at today. And exactly what this bike has, which is just an accumulation of everything that manufacturers have decided they wanted to do in the way of cranks and bottom brackets over just a number of years. 30 millimeter spindle, threaded bottom bracket shell, 86 millimeter width between the two, and a spindle that's part of the crank, not the bottom bracket. Okay, so kind of like a really long-winded and torturous story to get to a what is the point? Like what am I getting at? Well, put simply, is this. There was an explosion of popularity for BB30 and PF30 bottom bracket bikes for just like a certain amount of time that manufacturers really got on board and component manufacturers really also followed suit. Since these press fit bottom brackets are kind of like fizzling out, there is a absolute plethora of BB30 cranks that are just popping up everywhere for low pricing. And if you can make the spindle lengths and these cranks work with one of the threaded 30 millimeter bottom bracket sizes, then you can get yourself into something pretty sweet for not a lot of money. This is a PF30 BB30 spindled crankset that is built specifically for just that, and based on the advice of a one Gene Machine on the last update of the budget gravel bike build, says indeed that if the frame has a 68 millimeter bottom bracket and you use the gold FSA Mega Exo BB386 bottom bracket cups, it'll work with those BB30 rival cranks. And if that's the case, which we're about to try, well then the opportunity for baller cranks at low pricing just got wider. And hey, you know, just like real quick shameless plug, Spindatt.com, shirts, hats. So in the Poseidon, I do have the gold BB386 bottom bracket. You can see it, but it does have the wavy washer that, for the record, does have some place to move in it. So while this is put together at the proper torque, it does seem like there could be a shorter spindle in there. And while I don't know what the difference between the two is, I anticipate this being longer, being specific to this style bottom bracket, and that being shorter for sure, because it's supposed to go between a narrower bearing inside the frame BB30 bottom bracket shell. 10 centimeters, 9.7. 3 millimeter difference between the SRAM versus the FSA. However, I can't really put that in context how much of a difference that's actually going to make until I actually try and just put this in there and see what happens. Actually, I should take these chambers off. This does not work. This chainring bolt hits the chainstay. The chainring itself rubs on the chainstay the whole time. And then this chainring bolt also hits the chainstay. This particular tinker moment gets a letter grade of F for That is, of course, until you wake up at around 4:30 a.m. the next day, the Tuesday that this video is being uploaded, and realize the error of your ways. Realizing that your wavy washer was indeed on the wrong side, and that it should be swapped to take up the space and still offer the preload adjustment that you do need. And next thing you know, you're riding the doggone thing to work. Though, as is the case with all SRAM thick boy cranksets, the end of the crank arm does touch the chainstay. So, a small visit to Mr. File, or possibly Mr. Grinder, and a bit of a Sharpie fix ought to take great good care of that. No. This would be one of those moments that my father would ask, why didn't you just leave it the way it was? What was wrong with it? And my excuse would be, this is better. This is fine. It clears, it doesn't hit anymore. Okay, promise delivered with grandiose success. Rival BB30 PF30 crankset in a threaded BSA bottom bracket shell.